Welcome to the channel. I'm Kay the Guy. Today we have a special episode where I get to interview the Soul Food Web Master, Dr. Elaine Ingham. So without further ado, welcome everybody. Today it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce Chief Scientist and President of the Soul Food Web, Dr. Elaine Ingham. Welcome.
Glad to be here. I look forward to our chance to chat about my favorite topic in the world.
And one of my favorites as well. So those that don't know Dr. Elaine, would you like to describe what you do and what you've done?
What I do is look at different ways that we can improve plant production, nutrient concentrations, reduce high amounts of water in growing our plants. I want to get a maximum amount of nutrients into the plants so that your plant will be protected against disease-causing organisms. It's the lack of nutrients that prevent the plant from being able to get its immune system to function properly. And so if we can get all of those nutrients into the plant that it needs, on demand sort of thing, then that plant can it can turn on its immune system, and then it's pretty much safe from all the diseases and pest problems. But if there's no biology in the soil doing their job, then your plant is not going to get the nutrients it needs in the proper balances. And it always drives me crazy when people start talking about nitrogen, as if that's the only nutrient that there are in plants. Well, I'm sure, as you've all noticed, that we eat plants in order to get all of the nutrients. So don't we have to worry about those nutrients just as much as we need to worry about nitrogen? And the answer is a big hearty yes. So how does nature do that? Nature has been growing plants for the last billion years, rooted plants that require soil in order to grow. And so how has nature been doing this? Because I think she's got a little more smarts than us human beings have. She's been doing it by a billion years longer than we have. So coming along with the Green Revolution, where we were the masters of our own fate, we understood everything that was going on, and so we're working on all those ways of working with nature to grow our plants. So I was a professor at Oregon State University for some 15 years or so, and I got so much trouble at university about the fact that I was working with growers. That's not part of the ivory tower. We are above the average person out there working in the fields. Not all of the professors feel that way, but a significant number of them did, to affect, I think, basically my ability to get tenure. When in that conflict, I finally just kind of went, the people I'm really interested in working with are the growers. Getting them to change their ways, reduce the cost of growing those plants. Every time you have to go and get inorganic fertilizers and put them into your big equipment and back and forth across the field, how much does that cost?
Right.
It's a huge amount. And if you have to do that more than once a year, how can you make much profit? Which explains why their profit level was, very narrow.
Sure.
So they were always looking to grow more plants, increase the amount of fields that they were working on. And really, when you start thinking about what a single person can get to by themselves, maybe 20, maybe 40 acres if you've got a couple of offspring helping you, it's a totally, completely destructive way that the Green Revolution took us to the point where there are no microorganisms in soil. That material, what I just called soil, according to Hans Jenny's definition of what soil is, you've got to have organisms in there. You have to have organic matter in there. And it's not 1% organic matter. The bare minimum of soil organic matter is 3%. You drop down below that, and your microorganisms can't function for you. So, trying to get trying to work with growers for
Right.
the last 25 years or so. I've had a couple of started it here, and I'm discovered I'm not a business person. I'm a research scientist. So now we're at the Soil Food Web School
Right.
and Soil Food Web Incorporated.
So the soil food web, if you could give us kind of a brief summary of what that really means, the web of these organisms that you're talking about, kind of the non-research scientist definition of what it really all encompasses.
Well, think about growing a plant. You're not going to be the only person involved in getting that plant to grow and to harvest it to have seeds for the next year. It's a community project, typically. And understanding the system that nature has developed to grow those plants in the least expensive way. That's kind of what we're doing with the Soil Food Web. We're trying to understand the role and the function of all these organisms in the soil. And of course, I started out with bacteria and fungi because I'm a microbiologist. I've worked in marine microbiology, aquatic microbiology, soil, and you have to understand what bacteria and fungi are doing. But then when you look at what bacteria and fungi are actually doing, they're sequestering all those nutrients in their own bodies.
Right.
And now you've got to go, wait a minute, how's the plant getting that? The plant can't attack and rip apart a bacterial or a fungal cell. What's the process? So discovered early on that you've got to have the, oh surprise, predators in the system that will eat bacteria and fungi. And that's what releases the nutrients into the root system. Okay, why are you in the root system? So we go through all those, answering those questions about how can all of those nutrients get to the plant? How does the plant get the nutrients in the proper balances? Because it's the organism that needs the proper balances, and it takes into the root system the soluble inorganic forms of nutrients, which aren't found in dirt. You have no mechanism for making soluble inorganic nutrients available to your plant. What little bit might be there because something washed in from uphill isn't enough to keep your plants alive and healthy through an entire growing season. So we've got to establish what the bacteria and fungi and protozoa, they eat bacteria, nematodes. We have bacterial feeding nematodes and fungal feeding nematodes and predatory nematodes. Kind of in that one group of organisms, we've got a complete nutrient cycling system. Except what the plant needs is way more than the nematodes will be able to handle. So you've got to have the bacteria and the fungi being eaten by. So then you go on in the food web, and we're looking at earthworms. We understand incatraids. We're working on the micro arthropods, the macro arthropods, the bigger organisms, and all the way up to human beings. Have to understand the whole ecosystem, and then
And you
recognize
have to have
that
all of them present in order to have all of the macro and micronutrient and trace minerals available in order for the plants to get all of them.
exactly. It's not just presence of your organisms, because these organisms can all go to sleep and
Sure.
hang out for a while. We want them, the number of organisms and whether they're functioning or not.
And then that function, is that a determination based on the environment that they're in, whether that's a certain moisture or oxygen level?
And that's part of the list of it depends that we have to look at to understand how rapidly these functions are occurring right now. If there's not enough water, well, how do we build the structure in the soil to hold the water so your plant will never have to rely on rainfall when it rains? We want to store all that extra water instead of letting it leach over the surface and cause erosion, instead of letting it leach down through the soil and run out in our aquifer. We want to hold and store all of the water. And then, then people say, well, my roots only grow down this far well, if your roots are only growing that far into the soil, that is not soil. It's compacted, anaerobic. It will kill your root system. It'll kill your plant if they try to grow into that area. So they take the course of least resistance and they go sidewards. And then, of course, if this is a stalk of corn, and right here is a stalk of corn, now their root systems are fighting each other. Neither plant's going to be healthy. And so when that earworm comes along, yep, your plant's a goner.
Prone to pests.
So all sorts of disease and pests. Yeah. Very easy, therefore, to deal with these problems, because you just have to get these organisms back into the soil and let nature take due course. She'll make sure that everything happens in the right place at the right time.
Right. So we've had a lot of things in the news about global shortages, obviously conflicts in Eastern Europe, that where we get a large portion, a large market share, for over 44% of the potash supply globally. So it kind of leads me to the other question that we have here, which is, how can the understanding of the soil food web change the way we grow food, especially what we see with global interruptions and limitations of synthetic fertilizer production and distribution?
That's an easy one, because if you go back to growing plants the way we did, through the millennia, you don't need inorganic fertilizers. You don't need pesticides. You don't need all of those toxic chemicals. So no longer do you need potash. When you really understand the nutrient cycling of potassium or phosphate, whichever portion of that molecule that you need, you realize that you've got centuries, millennia, huge amount of nutrient present in any soil. It's just that it's inside the silica bilayers of the sand, the silt, the clay, the rocks, the pebbles, the parent material, the boulder. All of those things have massive amounts of nutrients in them. Mm-hmm. And the bacteria and the fungi make the enzymes to pull those nutrients out of the rocks. So, from all of your rock surfaces, we're only going to be taking a very small amount from any one place, but summarized over all of those surfaces, it's more than enough nutrient to grow your plant.
Sure.
So it's that, the plant tells the bacteria and fungi using exudates what nutrients it requires and what enzymes the bacteria and the fungi have to make in order to pull those nutrients into the bacterial and fungal biomass. Mm-hmm. Bacteria and fungi then have to be eaten by the protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, earthworms, incatraids. Any one of the above work just fine. And they poop out, which is why we usually call this the poop loop, because it's the fecal material coming out of these larger predators that actually turns all of those nutrients into a form that the plant can take up. And all of this is going on in the root system because it's the plant that put out the exudate. Bacteria and fungi in the root system that now make the enzymes and pull those nutrients. It's the protozoa and the nematodes that are attracted to that root system that result in the release of a soluble. It means it is in solution. So your plant can just take up the water and get all the nutrients that it needs. So it's a very elegant system when you start to understand it.
So it's kind of like you need the factory, which is your root zone. You need the workers, which is all your organisms that are actually producing things within the factory, to put all of these nutrients together to grow the end product of the plant, which is the food we see above ground.
And if there's any excess, like the bacteria and fungi got eaten by their predators, release the nutrients, the plant takes up what it needs, but there's excess soluble whatever nutrient you're working with. Excess is outside the root system. What happens is that wash out of the system and end up in the Mississippi River or whatever? And the answer is no, because the bacteria and fungi are still there. And they take up those nutrients and store them in their bodies. So there is no loss of soluble nutrients, and we stop destroying water quality
Right.
when we understand the system that nature put together, and we start promoting what nature has been doing for the last billion years.
The perfect system.
We don't end up with toxic anything moving through the system and causing problems with the water that you're trying to drink.
Right. Well, that leads me on to my next question, which I've also watched Dr. Bruce Bugbee of Utah State University, and he has stated, which he goes more into the chemistry side, but he has stated that whether through organic or synthetic means, plants take up nutrients following the same process or path. But based on what we know about synthetic nutrient production versus organic nutrient production through biology and their process, what is the difference in the carbon footprint from both?
When we're dealing with those inorganic materials where there are no microorganisms to pull those nutrients back into a body that will not leach, the biggest problem with the chemical end of things is you're killing all of those organisms. Every single inorganic fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer, is a salt, and it's going to take water up in order to have an adequate amount of liquid around those chemicals. Well, that means water has been taken away from the microorganisms, so you usually see the information of Mother Nature trying to convey to you that there's something very wrong in the soil because all your microorganisms are dying. If you don't pay attention to those important signals and go, oh no, my bacteria have dropped from 500 micrograms per gram of soil down to 100 micrograms per gram of soil, what's going on, something's wrong, and figure it out, then you're going to lose your plant. The plant needs that water too. So if you're putting down something that is a salt, sodium chloride, everyone thinks of that, table salt, but potassium hydroxide, that's a salt. When we're looking at calcium carbonate, that's a salt. When we look at, well, most any of the inorganic forms of nutrients are actually salts, and you're destroying the water balance and you're killing all the organisms that you have to do all of these beneficial things. You can't
Just like
form,
we can't drink salt water.
right. Yeah, it's a good analogy to make that kind of point. You know, here you are out on the ocean surrounded by massive amounts of water, but you don't dare drink it because it upsets that salt balance within your body, and that salt will eventually kill you. No different in soil. Right. So we've got to stop using those inorganic fertilizers. We need to understand what we're doing.
And just the process of what biology does versus what we do as humans in order to extract nitrogen, for example, using these large industrial machines that pull it out of the air, and the amount of natural gas that it takes to heat and then convert it into nitrogen versus the nitrogen that we're producing by having biology just do this normal process with no leaching inside the soil. It's got to be a vast difference in the amount of carbon output versus carbon negative that I would imagine that the biology is doing on its own.
When we look at the differences between fungi and bacteria have been promoted by the constant tillage in chemical agricultural systems. That means all of the fungi basically have been shredded to death, sliced and diced and ripped and pulled apart. So we're missing a major component of the food web. And it's really the fungi that have that ability to sequester the carbon in a soil organic matter form instead of as something soluble which washes away, or something that's released as a gas. Carbon dioxide is released as a gas. Bacteria are not efficient at keeping carbon within the soil, and if you look at that, how much carbon is being released, bacteria, for example, most of their foods are very narrow C to N ratios. Bacteria like high carbon materials, but they've got to sequester, they've got to pull out the nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, magnesium, calcium, sodium, potassium, all of those things from that carbon lattice work that occurs when you're talking about any carbon-based molecule. And so the bacteria are pulling those nutrients out, but it's taking that carbon that was once in the form of a sugar and it's releasing it as CO2. Well, that's an extremely inefficient use of that carbon. Fungi start working on the much more complex sugars, the complex amino acid, the very complex humics and fulvics. And when they do that, they're pulling most of that carbon into their body and they're not releasing it as CO2. When people have been using release of CO2 as an indicator of what kinds of microorganisms are present in their soil, they've missed this point. That bacteria, if they're eating on something that has 30 carbons for every 1 nitrogen, the bacteria wants that nitrogen. So it's going to rip the nitrogen out of there and release those 30 molecules of carbon as carbon dioxide. So in the life cycle of one bacterium, think of the massive amount of CO2 that's being released because of that. When fungi utilize those more complex sugars, the fungus still needs those nutrients, but it takes that carbon and puts it as surface layers on the inside of the older hyphae. Because they need to be protected from the attempts of nematodes trying to eat their hypha further on. The older and older it gets, that hyphae trail that they leave requires more carbon to be put on the inside of that hypha, of that strand, so that when something attacks that strand and tries to eat it, they can't pull it apart because of the inner steel core that's present in that fungus.
That's an increase in dexterity?
It's like when you put up a metal insert behind your drywall, for example, because you want this to be the room that you store all of your treasures in, something along that line.
Like a safe.
Yeah, like a safe. And that's what that fungus is trying to do is if something comes up with their spear and tries to puncture that cell wall, it can't get in for love nor money because the fungus has completely covered the inside of that hypha with this strong layer of almost pure carbon.
It's almost the same way a tree grows bark to protect itself.
That's right. Yep,
Wow.
That's a good analogy.
Wow. So also going along those lines with chemistry, Dr. Bruce has stated, his arguments. He used to be organic, but then obviously he understands chemistry, so he likes both, he says. But he says that compost has a high phosphorus capacity, causing an issue with leaching into lakes and rivers. But how does the biology
right there.
how does the biologically complete compost methodology counter this general theory?
Well, that's where you have to have enough organic material so that whatever concentrations of nutrients go into the starting material, they will be diluted to the appropriate level. And if what you're putting into that pile is a manure that is extremely high in phosphorus or extremely high in potassium, any of those things that we tend to overindulge when we are trying to get this plant to grow, and so it needs more nitrogen, and that's not the problem at all. It's something else, and so when that manure coming through the animals has all that excess, and now you're going to try to make compost, you're not going to be successful because those nutrients that are in excess are going to be taking all the water away from your microorganisms, because that's what salts do. So we have these excess amounts of nutrients in the manure going into the pile, which means you need to be aware of that. So you dilute those nutrients that are in excess with the woody material in the pile or the green material in the pile. manure is usually considered to be high nitrogen,
Hmm.
and there are cases where it's not high nitrogen because the balance of those nutrients is the phosphorus is higher, or the potassium is higher, or the calcium is too high, or magnesium, or all of the different nutrients. And I love it when people say, um, everything needs just nitrogen is the only thing we're worried about in the soil. And I always kind of, well, you really don't know much about soil, do you, or about the needs of plants, when someone makes that statement that the major thing we have to take care of is nitrogen, or potassium, or phosphate. They're all necessary.
Right.
And if you don't have any one of those many nutrients that your plant requires, it's not going to be able to turn on its immune system.
So, for better clarification to Dr. Bruce's statement, what he would probably be referring to would be more along the lines of reduced waste and not biologically complete compost. And when we're assembling these and using a microscope to verify our results, there's a huge difference between the two.
Yep. And we shouldn't allow reduced waste. That should not be the goal of a place where you're taking waste material and you're going to work with it. You need to be aware of what are the nutrients in this material, what might be too high and what might be too low, and start putting together the mixes so that you don't run into that problem. You really
Right.
have to understand. Come springtime, and you're coming from an agricultural field, you're getting a massive amount of phosphorus and potassium, maybe even sulfur. Um, so you have to account for that by putting in more green materials that don't have excesses of these high nutrients that people have been pounding into their soil. Better yet, don't even buy those toxic chemicals. If you can't put some of that in your mouth and eat it without killing yourself, um, sort of the same thing applies to your plants. You're killing your plants. Well, if you would pick up that clover and chow down on a leaf or two, it's not going to harm you. It may not taste wildly wonderful, but the nutrients are balanced for organisms if you've grown those plants in a natural fashion.
So, our organic matter, accompanied with a biology, essentially become a soil sponge slash filter so that we're not leaching any of these toxic, either chemicals, inorganic or organic, into our waters and lakes and streams. So when we're strategically putting compost together and then monitoring with a microscope, we're eliminating that leaching process, which a synthetic grow operation can't guarantee that type of result, like the soil food web can with how they structure the soil using the intention with the microscope.
Yep. And that microscope work tells you when things are going badly in the pile and you need to fix something, and it tells you what needs to be fixed very clearly. Not very little guesswork about it if you understand what losing the bacteria or the fungi or the protozoa or nematodes or microarthropods, you can interpret what you need to do to
Right.
fix that problem back out in the field or in the next round of compost that you're making.
And that's what you've been teaching for the last, few decades.
Yeah, yeah. When did I first start teaching this? I've tried to think about that. It's probably 35 years ago
Hmm.
where I really started, in my ecology classes at Oregon State University, or going out and giving talks around the world. And that's what made it possible, really, for me to strike out on my own without the university support, if you will.
Sure.
And I like talking to growers because they're really hungry for this kind of information. How can we grow our plants without having to spend all the money that we made on the last crop? It really gets into a bad situation for most growers, trying to make money and being able to send their kids to college or buy a new car for them or
Right.
whatever.
Which I would imagine, just from, I'm an entrepreneur, and so closing your loop and producing your own materials to manufacture whatever it is that you produce obviously is a huge cost savings, as well as, water and material, input material, are the one of the biggest overheads when it comes to your business model. And so being able to just recycle what you have by knowing what you can input and then using a microscope to verify the organisms present, it's got to be a huge reduction in overall costs and then obviously increase in yields over time.
And we've started to document exactly how much you might be saving. So, for example, working with growers in the Hudson River Valley in New York and surrounding states, they're showing that 2,000 acres of trial where you've converted over to using the biology. You don't have to use inorganic fertilizers, so that deletes. And it's not just the fertilizer that you're buying, it's all of the application and measuring and documenting that you've gotten enough nitrogen into the system. It's going to be on all of those other nutrients you don't have to worry about anymore, but then we're building structure in the soil. We're reducing the amount of water you have to pay for if you're in that part of the world that we start charging outrageous amounts of money for acre feet of water to grow your plants. And so when we go and when we work and look at, we add all of the savings into the budget here. Over $3 million were saved in the first year of growing the organisms. Every year they increase the biology, they move further along to the desired point, such that, following that curve, they're increasing the amount of money that they're saving. And so example after example after example after example of that from all over the world. Tomatoes in South Africa and vegetable fields in Spain and corn, cotton, soybean in Brazil and bananas in Ecuador and just every place around the world. If you understand what we've lost and need to put back in, and making the compost, using the liquid extracts from that compost as a very simple and easy way to apply that biology. And then monitor by watching what's going on in your soil, so you make certain that the biology that you're putting in with the extracts or the tea or the compost are replenishing the needed and necessary organisms. It usually doesn't take very long to get the grower back into a condition where they don't need us anymore.
I heard one farmer, he said he kind of took the long approach where it took him 20 years to do it using animal cycling throughout his property on 3,000 acres, I believe in Georgia. And I was thinking to myself, I've heard all these case studies from being in school at the Soil Food Web where they're talking about one season where they're getting replenishment back to these normal levels. And so it doesn't take 20 years by moving animals across, having them do that inoculation through their feces into the system. Most of the time, it just takes a intentional microscopic analysis with the proper inputs and amendments, whether compost or liquid amendments, that's actually just going to turn that system around very expeditiously.
Yep, I always think it's fun when we tell the people with animals that really all they have to do is go out and take some bales of hay, soak it in a compost tea, compost extract, get all those organisms into all parts of that bale, and then take that out into the field. And as you throw it over the edge of the truck or drop it from the helicopter, you've sliced the ropes holding that bale together. So when it lands on the ground, it kind of falls apart. And then, of course, all of the animals are going to come over and go, hoo-hoo, we've got a treat. Come on over. And they're sloppy eaters. They
Sure.
get their feet in it. They get all these good organisms spread all over the surface, the outside surface of their body, all over the inside of their body, and so everywhere they go for the next 5 to 6 days, 5 to 7 days, they're spreading this inoculum throughout the whole pasture. So you can speed this up.
These desirable organisms, I would imagine, go through their system almost the same way a probiotic would.
They inoculate, and some portion of the biology stays in their rumen, so that now you stop having problems with bloating types of diseases where just so much gas occurs. The animal, it's not a fun way to die, and getting all those nutrients back, increasing the uptake of the nutrients that the animal needs, as well as putting back out the organisms that your plants require.
So switching gears back to fungi, because I like talking about fungi because it seems like this mysterious organism creature that does so much work, and it's usually the most missing from most systems. Um, so fungi, particularly like the VAM spores, which are the vesicular arbuscular mycorrhiza spores, these ones we really like seeing in our soil systems because they contribute to kind of that secondary assistance to the root systems. Where can we find information if somebody's looking under the microscope and really wants to identify the types of spores that are favorable in this direction? Where can we find some information of like, how do we recognize the good guys?
You might want to get one of our consultants, because they've been through a course basically that we talk about how you deal with endomycorrhizal fungi versus ectomycorrhizal fungi, and some of the kind of variants where there's very specific relationships with certain kinds of plants. And it is very important to recognize the difference between the endomycorrhizal, vesicular, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that form they look like little tiny trees inside the cells of the root. So arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi versus ecto, which are it's a layer on the outside of the root system where the fungus just completely engulfs the surface of that root, which is really healthy for that plant, and you'll actually see a reduction in the amount of root system that a plant has when it gets covered with that ectomycorrhizal formation on the outside. The hyphae continue to grow, bringing back all the nutrients as the plant demands those nutrients, and it's a very fast turnaround. Takes a little bit longer perhaps with the VAM, or the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So where would you go for information? Well, any one of our consultants would be able to help you, and if they can't figure out what's going on, they'll usually call me in on it. And if I can't figure it out with them, then we turn around and we start talking to like Peter McAvoy or some of the other people that they concentrate on the mycorrhizal fungi and the mycorrhizal fungi alone. Paul Stamets, that's who I was thinking of. So people who focus in on just that, you can pretty quickly figure out. For example, I'm not going to remember the people's name, but in Florida there's a group studying the mycorrhizal fungi, and when you go to their website, there's actually, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, there's a little place for you to write the name of the fungus that you're interested in, or the name of the plant that you want to know about, and it will go through all of the literature that they've been looking at for the last longer than I've been alive, sort of thing.
Okay.
And they'll identify for you what kind of mycorrhizal fungus that plant requires.
Well, we'll have to get that website from you.
One last thing I want to probably say about the mycorrhizal fungi is, please be aware that most of our early successional plant species will actually be harmed by becoming mycorrhizal. Well, if what you're trying to do is get rid of the weeds, perfect. Get the mycorrhizal fungi in there and say goodbye to the weeds. They just do not do well.
It's not conducive.
Right. But in some of the herbs that we grow, some of those early successional plant species, they are non-mycorrhizal. So you have to know these things about your plant, which kind of mycorrhizal fungi, or that you really don't want any mycorrhizal fungi. And if you don't want any mycorrhizal fungi, probably the easiest way to deal with that is to till your soil. Just don't over-till. There's no reason to do more than one tillage when you're trying to keep things in that disturbed condition.
Would another recipe, and this is what I've noticed from being a student, is that once you're finished making a compost pile, which you're shooting for all the different types of organisms, but once it's done and it starts going through the maturation phase, uh, the fungi is kind of at a minimum level. Would it be proper advice to say that that type of compost could be used well for early successional, and then a more mature compost pile would be better suited for those ones that do want that kind of fungi?
Yep. And so control the organisms that are growing in your compost by putting in bacterial foods if you want that early successional set of plant species growing. Add fungal foods, like a fish hydrolysate or humic acid materials. So very complex substrates, because that's what's going to select for the fungi and get you up into those higher successional stages. So it's pretty easy to do that. What should I be adding? We'll put in more bacterial food, or we'll put in more fungal food.
Well, that's one stage that I'm currently at, which is finishing the biocomplete composting methodology, which I hit a bit of a stalemate, and I have all three successive piles completed, and now I'm at the maturation phase, which I've been in for about 3 or 4 months now. And so I'm just it's kind of like a hurry up and wait situation, that I just slowly just wait and have my my fungal biomass numbers reach the proper numbers. Now, my nematode numbers are great, my protozoa numbers are great, my bacteria numbers are all at the minimums, my ciliate numbers are very low. But that's one of the biggest challenges I've seen when it comes to building compost, is that patient process with growing fungi. And what advice could you give to either me or other people that are in that same process, or at that same point where now we're waiting for fungi to do its thing? What advice could you give us?
I probably would point you towards what you're doing with the woody materials before you ever put them into the pile. So have a pile of these kinds of wood chips and inoculate those wood chips with the mixture of really good fungi that you've probably got growing in your compost piles. So take some handfuls from there and inoculate that woody material. Make sure you keep it covered so that moisture through a dry summertime period, through the winter time, cover it so when you get snow, if you get snow, when that snow melts, it'll put absolutely everything back into a very stressed condition. And so quite often you'll lose some of your fungi because they just can't stand freezing water, freezing rain coming through the compost pile. As that snow melts and it moves into your compost pile, you have put everybody into dormancy in a very painful way. So protect your plants, protect that material by putting them under a tarp.
Now, I'm in quite a cold condition. I'm in zone 6A in the Rocky Mountain region, and all my compost piles are in the garage at the moment. And the last time I checked, which is I would say 2 to 3 months ago, I kind of just let them sit. And I did see some rhizomorphs when I was moving the piles from outside to inside, so a good sign. But my fungal biomass numbers were about 44 micrograms per gram. when I put everything into the garage. What would I do, or what would I monitor in order to continue to increase those numbers to our minimum 135?
Um, I take a look at some of the fungi that you have.
Mhm.
Um, and probably what I would do is take some foods for the fungi that you lack in that pile and try to bring those fungal species along. Even going out into the forest and digging down through the um, O horizon, when you move that whatever is up there, so dead leaves and things like that, where you can tell what plant they came from, and entirely undecomposed, and it would worry me a little bit that those leaves weren't decomposing in the fall period. They really should. There should be enough fungi out there to do that decomposition process, especially if you had some decent rains. And so all of that organic material is now the organic layer at the surface of the soil. But dig through that and get to that part of the soil that has that really rich 70% cocoa chocolate color.
Mhm.
And that's where you're going to find inoculative, some really good fungi. And pull some of that. You don't need much. A handful is going to inoculate 5 or 6 piles.
Mhm.
So bring that back so you've got a wider diversity. It
Okay.
may just be a lack of diversity that's kind of hampering your ability to grow those really good fungi.
Mhm.
They may be in there. You might want to pick some fungal foods, and so like a humic acid, and please, make sure that it's really humic acid. There are people in the world of humic acids that want to talk about a humic acid that has 10 to 12 carbons in it, and that's all. Well,
Hmm.
that's not a humic acid. Sorry, that's they've gotten hold of one teeny tiny part of the molecule, and describing the chemistry of that. Well, but it's not a humic acid. We want something that's got 5,000,
Mhm.
10,000 carbons in that material, and it's very easily utilized by the microorganisms, by fungi.
As you said, fungi, um, they like to pull apart very complex materials. So obviously, you need a buffet if you're going to feed fungi.
Yep. If we'd like to have, like 1,000 species of fungi in your compost pile, and each one likes a little bit different food. Each one has different requirements of temperature and moisture and how much moving and mixing of the pile is happening. Some fungi like slightly more disturbed. Other fungi don't want any disturbance at all, and if you disturb them, you cause them to go into dormant conditions. So you've got the whole gamut in there. So when that compost gets out on your land and you're trying to grow plants, you will have somebody growing every second of every day
Mm.
throughout, the whole day, night, and on into winter. The most rapid rates of decomposition ever recorded on this planet were from the Rocky Mountains,
Mhm.
and through some of the work that we did with Dave Coleman's group, and looking at a sequence from the disturbed shortgrass prairie through tallgrass prairie into high mountain meadows, and then
Mhm.
into the forested shrubs and trees.
Mhm.
And making certain that we had all the proper biology in there. The most rapid rates of decomposition occurred in the wintertime under the
Wow.
snow. And so getting those organisms back into your places that you're going to go pull that diversity, we want to be working on that as well, because all the glyphosate sprays, all of the toxic
Mm.
chemicals, they blow with the wind.
Mhm.
And it's like there was a study done in Australia where they were applying pesticides up around Ingham, and up in that area. And they tagged some of that material so they could determine how far downwind that pesticide actually carried. and it was over 500 miles away. So if you think about the Great Plains of the United States and the amount of toxic chemicals we're spraying on, there's no surprise why we get things up in the mountains in Wyoming and Colorado that are showing the damage to their food webs, and they're not functioning properly. We think that because it's 500 miles or more away that it's not being impacted, but it is. We have a lot of work and restoration to do on this planet before we can kind of pat ourselves on the back and say we've done the job.
Right, right. For my setup, just to kind of get back to, you're talking about humic acids. I have a compost pile I finished after FC course, and then to kind of further refine its properties, I created about a 14-gallon bin that I have worms in. I turned it into a vermicompost bin, which it has a ton of diversity. I did my CLP retest for my yearly certification with that, which my tester had commented how amazing the sample looked because it had so much diversity in it. Would you suggest that I use some of that vermicompost to extract the humic acid out of it to put into the compost piles?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's different food resource than what you've got in the windrows or the cages that we use. So yeah, and that's one of the joys of worm bins is that first you'll start, if you order worms, you want to kind of think about who are you buying from, and buy it from the closest resource, because you're more likely to get those species of organisms that will survive and do things in your soil, in your biome. And then let any worms from outside that are just living in your grass or your organic material pick up. You find 6 worms. Well, take 3 of them and stick them into your worm bin, because you're bringing all that diversity,
Right.
all that. Yeah, and we know we need to maximize diversity. So the more you can do, the more of taking some of your worm compost and adding it to your thermal piles, that's going to expand. Well, and vice versa. Take some of your thermal piles and put it into your worm piles.
Right.
So you're
Right.
just increasing diversity every chance you get.
Well, I want to move on to our next question, which talks more about the school. But what do you think has been the biggest challenge to opening the public and potential students to Soil Food Web principles?
It's that there's so many things that the biology affects, and to understand all of those different benefits that you get from getting this biology back into the system, and making certain that you've got maximum diversity of everybody functioning the way they should.
Is there a challenge that you face from maybe previous education or generations of people doing conventional things of agriculture that has kind of been tough for them to grasp just to fully rely on biology?
Yeah, we have that problem with compost. Because we're not leaving it to just, we'll throw stuff over there in the corner and it will just disintegrate and decompose and we'll be able to come along. No, you can't, because it's probably horribly anaerobic. You've got all kinds of disease-causing organisms for both human beings and for the plants. It's not good stuff and until you know it's good stuff, and that's what the microscope is for.
Right.
And we've really come to terms with the fact in the school that you can't rely on people who come to a single talk, hear, 10%, 30%, 60%, to make a good compost pile. They have to turn it. They must measure temperature. They don't want to turn it until it's been above 131 degrees Fahrenheit for a full 3 days. You can't really touch it before that. Now you can turn it, you can get the outside to the inside and what was inside to the outside, because everything's got to be in that hot middle. Well, so a lot of people say, well, then I'm going to use earthworms. and that should work. Well, yeah, but there's a certain turning schedule that you need to have with a worm bin. So they've got to, and it's too much detail for them. They
Mm.
don't like being tied down. They can't go on vacation because they've got to be testing the temperature in their thermal pile, or they've got to make certain to put on more food for their earthworms. And so we're really kind of looking at having hubs around the world where the people will make the really good compost for their biome, the
Right.
one that they live in. And so getting people who will turn that into a business. And
Right.
since I am not a business person and learned that fact, I'm way more interested in the biology and the organisms. So we're trying to put together the business information for people to get the hubs up and going.
Right.
Um, it's a huge difference when you're dealing with people that are just doing kind of backyard, small scale gardens, maybe 1 acre, 2 acre, maybe even up to 30 acre farms, as compared to when we're dealing with people that have 1,000 hectares
Right.
or 50,000 hectares. We're
Right.
working with some groups in Southeast Asia where it's 150,000 hectares that
Wow.
we're going to be replenishing the proper biology back into that system. And then we'll be able to show how rapidly that can happen. What are the changes? Exactly what do you have to keep track of? But I can see where in those conditions, the growers aren't capable of producing a really good compost
Mm-hmm.
in the first year. So we need to do that for them.
Yeah.
So there's lots of potential for people to come through and learn what we're doing and then
Mm-hmm.
go out for a couple years, work with smaller scale people until you get your biome figured out, all the ins and outs, and what are the surprise winters. Like this winter here in Oregon is, whoa, we haven't seen one like this for 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How dare it snow on my roses?
Well, and
Yep.
just for reference sake, after getting through FC and COP courses and understanding the microscope and getting into the CTP course, it only took me, it was pretty consistent, but each pile took 11 to 12 days to finish. So that's 600 pounds of compost, original material, finished in basically just over 30 days. So, and that 600 pounds is enough to inoculate lots and lots of acreages.
Especially if you turn it into a compost extract
Yes.
and apply it that way, you get even a higher amount of land that you can start this process.
Right, right. So it doesn't take forever. It doesn't take years to make compost. I mean, it took me, for 200 pounds, it took me 11 days later, I had a compost pile that was finished and starting to mature. So it's one of those things that it's not rocket science, but understanding the science is the key important process to making the kinds of compost that is the tailored recipe for success.
Yep. It's like making cookies in your kitchen.
Hmm.
If you don't really pay attention to the requirements, most of your cookies are going to come out either not cooked enough
Right,
or cooked too much
right,
or gosh, too much salt got in there,
right,
or I thought these were supposed to be chocolate chip cookies. There's no chocolate chips in my cookie.
right. Does
So
the butter need
there's
to be
all
room
those.
temperature or cold? There's a certain chemistry to the actual ingredients that they have to be at to get the proper result.
So it depends part of making compost is no different than it depends making cookies or
Hmm.
whatever, doing popcorn or whatever you want to be making. So you have to keep track of what you're doing and keep notes what worked previously.
Right,
And so if you made a really great pile and you didn't write down what the starting materials were or what you added to make things better, it's almost like that pile was a waste of time.
hmm,
make sure you leave a written trail for everything that you're doing so you can go back and figure out pretty quickly how to maximize benefit.
We went over kind of the small and large scale operations and kind of how they're implementing Soul Food Web to reduce costs, reduce water usage. But when it comes to some smaller farms that are striving to be 100% organic, but are struggling with letting go with conventional practices, what advice do you give to those people that are kind of teetering at that point?
They do have to commit to doing at least some of their fields. It doesn't have to be real large. Why not get practice on a quarter acre or a half acre, where you're not trying to do your whole farm. It's figuring it out, getting the microorganisms into a pile of compost where when you apply it out in your fields, it gives you that rapid improvement, that you're going to get all 11 of the overarching principles reestablished, so you don't have to worry about watering in the middle of the dry summer period. So you don't have insect pests, you don't have weeds, you don't have all of the problems there. You're making your own organic material underneath your existing plants, and so there's a constant source of material that you don't have to be worrying about. I'm going to have to go buy the straw, I'm going to have to buy the hay, I'm going to have to buy. Nope, make it all on your own property.
So start small and expand from that point, and let the results be the confidence booster to implement 100%.
Yep, very good. Thank you for summarizing me.
So what would you say has been the most dramatic, where you've seen something that was just like, wow, this is dirt or sand, or I don't know if anything's going to grow here, to being just a complete 180 change of wow, you can grow anything here now? What example would you say would be the best example of that, most dramatic?
Probably the most dramatic one for me was working with people up in Montana on grasslands, where they were having problems with just getting grass to grow in their fields. And they'd overdone it on the inorganic fertilizer. If a little bit is good, more is better. And well, that didn't work too well. We better put on more. And well, that we got a little bit of response. It's going in the right direction. We better put more on. They're following the wrong pathway. That's the one that leads straight to, hell. You're not going to be able to keep your farm. And so we came out with, it was one of those big trucks with the liquid carrier, so it could remain cool and not overheat on the way to the property. And they started spraying the field, and we went along just in front of them before the truck got there, and we took a lot of samples from the field. So we knew that the compaction was probably at about 1.5 inches into the soil. Wow. So the root systems were of the few existing grass plants that were present in that field, very, very patchy. When the wind blew, some of their soil went flying downwind. So I was like, get this out here as rapidly as possible, because you're losing your topsoil. It does that all the time. Okay.
Wow.
No wonder you're having problems.
It's like a dust bowl situation.
Definitely. And so we saw that compaction was right there. The plants were definitely showing signs. Mother Nature was trying to tell the grower all kinds of things and just being ignored. You ignore Mother Nature, and she's going to get angry at you, and she's going to get nasty. And he was definitely on that process. And so applied the compost extract to the field, and then the control plot was right next. The other half of the field was the control plot. Came back in 4 weeks, walked out into the pasture, and the plants in the plus biology side were definitely greener growing faster. Nothing much happening over with the conventional system. We walked out with our penetrometer, and I was expecting to have, a little bit of improvement. Walked over, put the tester into the ground, and I was putting in a lot of effort because I just knew that compaction wasn't going to have gone down that far, 4 feet.
Wow.
And I just about landed on my face.
Wow.
Because the penetrometer went all the way down 4 feet, just that easy, that simple, and
After a 4 week
great.
application.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yep. So you can get results that fast. They must have been, it was a really good idea to have the compost tea in that cool container driving out there, because those organisms just responded amazingly. I think it probably also helped that it was the springtime of the year and we actually got some rain in between. So, and I'm sure then that every drop of that rain stayed in the structure of the soil that had been renewed, and they now had 4 feet of soil that could hold all of that extra water. So, it was a blessing to these guys. They had all of the food they needed to feed their animals through the whole of their of the time the animals are out on pasture. And they could leave the animals out longer in that field. So lots of benefit. And yes, they converted over. I haven't kept up with them, so it's like we need to go back to all of our long-term clients and say, couldn't you just give us a little bit of a hint? How are you doing today? What's happened? I know on a few of the farmers, they've been able to reduce their acreage and reduce it down to where they're getting the same profit that they need and they want for their family and things that they're doing, but they don't have to be applying, they don't have to be growing in 2,000 acre situations. They're down to 800 or 500, which is a much easier life when you're dealing with that.
Using less, even if you're harvesting any grass using tractors or whatever, you're using less fuel, less resources to produce more.
And so we want to get everybody understanding that these things are possible. We're already doing them all over the world.
Well, in your experience globally, what has been, based on the environment, what has been the most difficult, or maybe I know there's been obviously real rapid turnarounds in these systems, but what has been maybe the hardest ecosystem to apply soil food web principles versus the easiest? Does it all respond the same?
Pretty much, because I've been going around for the last 45 years trying to understand that variability in different ecosystems. So if you have banana plantation at 300 feet above the ocean level, and then you start going up and up and up, and now here we are at a mile high in the sky with the bananas. And you've got to understand that you can't do exactly what up at 5,000 feet. You can't do that down at 200 feet.
Right.
And so we have to train people. The biggest problem is that we've got people doing the applications, and some of them, as soon as you walk out the door, they're going to go, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. If we come back early or we come back at an unexpected time and look at what they're doing, it's you are not following directions. And if you don't follow directions, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, we can't guarantee any sorts of results.
Success is less based on the ecosystem globally and more dependent on the humans that are tending to it.
So it's, if everyone would follow directions, it would be very easy to have really good results. But some people just can't do it, and we have to give up and walk away and say, well, let us know when you want to start doing everything according to our directions, and we'll be back. But there's no point in us staying and beating our heads against this brick wall. It was a waste of their money, basically, because they just wouldn't listen.
It's the commitment to this change and not continuing with old habits or bad habits that allow this process to take place, and so that farmer can rely on Mother Nature and not the work of their own hands or human hands when it comes to whatever they're applying, whether that's a pesticide or an herbicide or a synthetic nutrient, but just really kind of trusting what Mother Nature can do its best at doing.
She's only been doing this for the last billion years. And when you think of how long before plants, these microorganisms were putting up their soil food webs. Mm-hmm. Bacteria have been on this planet for 4 billion years. Fungi for about 3.5 billion years. I mean, give or take a million years in there based on exactly where you're measuring around the world. Why we went away from that is, well, it's really a story about people's greed. We came back from World War I, we came back from World War II, and decided that the only way to get rid of all of the TNT that had been produced and now happily sitting in somebody's safeguarded somewhere, because in World War II, for example, the war ended a full 2 years before anyone expected it, because we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so what do you do with 2 years worth of TNT lying around on your property? Oh, guess what? It will help your plants grow. We just have to not call it trinitroglyceride. We've got to call it inorganic nitrogen. And it's always really interesting to look at some of the ads that were put into the newspapers. It's your patriotic duty to use these inorganic fertilizers so you will maximize yield, and we'll be able to feed our boys coming home. We were feeding everybody just fine, but it certainly is a lot easier. It appears a lot easier to use that approach instead of working with nature, who can be a little bit arbitrary.
It's a course correction in human history is what we're really trying to achieve.
Yeah, because otherwise us human beings aren't going to be here.
Mm-hmm. Well, when it goes back to the Soul Food Web School, you're Dr. Elaine, and so you have the PhD and then the alphabet soup behind your name. But when it comes to teaching, farmers, and I know that your early teachings of the Soul Food Web were at conventions and some of these larger events where you're speaking to groups of people. How long did it take, or what really did it take in order to make a curriculum that a layperson could understand?
I still tend to be too scientific in the information that I give. I'm trying to tone it down a little bit, make more statements that are easy for people to follow. Because I always want to get down to the nitty and the gritty and all of the places where, well, we did this research and it doesn't work. This way of doing things doesn't work all that well in conditions like this. If you're, I've done some amount of work in Saudi Arabia, and that's an environment that it took a while to figure out. But I think we've done it. There's lots of other people doing work in these conditions. In the conditions that you find in Saudi, there's huge differences, or there are very minor differences as you go around the world, and you just have to learn to apply them correctly. And I always want to. The application goes in 2 weeks later. I want to see what's going on in the soil. Has anything been fixed? Biology really, we put in a huge load of extra organisms, and they all disappeared. They're all gone. Nothing's working. Then I know that we've got a toxic chemical in that dirt, and we're going to have to do something to deal with that toxic chemical. What could it be? Which is why you always want to have taken the soil chemistry samples and sent them off, because just about the time you're going, all the bacteria and the fungi and the protozoa and the nematodes all died. What do? That's just about the time the soil chemistry information comes back to you. And you look at it and you go, okay, this sure looks like 2,4-D or DDT or one of the other toxic chemicals. And so we've got to go through with those special microorganisms to decompose that material. So could we find those organisms in the surrounding biome? Yes. And so we'll put that into our compost pile, but we'll possibly go and buy an inoculum that's specifically meant to decompose some of these really toxic materials. Put it out, and we see the toxicity go away, and there we go. We've got things settled. You and your microscope are the most important things to
Right.
have there to keep looking at how well did we do.
Well, that's what I appreciated about the school was the kind of the integration between the scientific atmosphere of fields integrating into more of like a trade school process of this is how you use a microscope scientifically with these procedures to make this result with growing plants. And that's what I appreciated about it, because the procedure wasn't laid out in some kind of crazy unable to understand type jargon. It was real easy and really able to understand. I didn't really have any background in this, and so being able to jump in and just understand the process that you have created using bits and pieces of scientific procedure that go into this step 1, step 2, step 3 is really been able for me to understand how that process works really well. And using the analogies I've seen that you use for cakes and cookies in order to understand how plants interact with these organisms, and all those analogies also kind of help put those puzzle pieces together, at least for me.
And so there's kind of some people come and they just take the FC. So they understand the basics of why this works. And then they pick a laboratory they're going to work with. They pick a consultant that they want to work with. And that works for the majority of people, to have that kind of people standing behind them telling them, oh, do this. Well, we're going to have to try 2 or 3 things here and see which one works best. And then there's people who just want to have laboratories, so they take the microscope classes that get you really down into the science of using the microscope, so that they can take samples from anybody who sends them in, anyone in the country, same country, because you're going to have enough work locally that you really don't have to go further afield than your own biome. So they do the assessments and send back the assessment, and that's usually where then you also need a consultant to read that laboratory report and say, this is the important piece of information, this is important, and that's going to tell you what the next things are that you need to do. So the consultant then has actually gotten hands-on practice doing something, doing a conversion and being successful at it. And I don't know any of our students that haven't been able to have good results, show that yes, this biology really does work. Sometimes when there's kind of a new and interesting twist to something, we'll have to take a little bit of time to figure out how do you deal with that.
So the student base is not just a group of people that you're teaching how to measure all of these changes in this microbiome, but more or less there are a lot of researchers that are bringing all this data to the school that is allowing Soil Food Web to become kind of the pinnacle or the point of biological research when it comes to growing plants as well, because you guys are, I'm assuming, making new discoveries on a fairly consistent basis.
And we have a research arm, so all of that kind of data, all of that information, processing it there, trying to put it into our curriculum, so that everything is set in the same approach, the same way of expressing ourselves, so you don't get confused with some of the scientific lingo that people are coming up with. Yeah.
Well, that leads me kind of to our last closing question here, which is where do you see the Soul Food Web community of the educated researchers and consultants in the next 5 to 10 years, and what do you hope is their effect on local ecosystems around the world?
I'm sure hoping that we can cause recovery in all of the ecosystems around the world that need our help, and that we can do this very rapidly, because we certainly know all the basics for all of the kinds of ecosystems that are out there. Every once in a while, it's finding out what insanity did human beings apply to this in order to have this kind of situation in the soil. Um, it's there's some things in Australia with sulfur based sands that are just, yeah, I don't know how we're going to fix that one yet. But it will be the microbiology, because it's microorganisms that are causing the problem. And so we'll fix that.
Any
Uh,
expansions on the school that you want to elaborate on?
yeah, we want to have schools in each country, basically,
Hmm.
so that we're teaching the ideas to the people who speak the same language.
Mm.
So we definitely want one down in Brazil, for
Hmm.
example, over in Southeast Asia, India, in Europe, uh, so everywhere. And then also have hubs where people are making the compost for people, because that always is the limiting factor.
Mm.
When you explain to people what they need to do, you share the microscope work with them, and you come back the next time and they're not happy, it's not working. Well, show me your compost and show me the data from your compost piles. And they go, well, we didn't really think that was necessary. Okay, I think I can tell you 100% that where it went wrong was you didn't put any decent biology back into the
Hmm.
soil. So
Hmm.
how can you expect that it's going to do any good? You know, a lot of growers are just absolutely, we're already too busy. We can't handle another whole department in our farming process. Um, so the logical thing for us to do is to make that compost for them. And it's very much then like driving to the local feed store and picking up your inorganic fertilizer. Well, what growers should do nowadays is driving to the feed store or driving to the hub and picking up the compost of the right kind with the right sets of organisms to promote the growth of the plant that you want to grow.
The goal is more ambassadors around the world that are able to do that microscope work to actually verify people's efforts in changing to Soul Food Web principles, but getting those ambassadors out in multiple languages, multiple countries, in order for us to change this carbon footprint and sequestration that we've been talking about into all our local environments across the globe.
Hmm. And we love to have people like you helping us send out that message.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I'll leave the link below for the Soul Food Web School, as well as information that we talked about in today's podcast. I just want to thank Dr. Elaine again for joining us.
Well, and thank you very much for letting me have a place where I can express ideas and we can chat and talk about what's the cutting edge that's going on.
A big thanks to Dr. Elaine for taking the time out of her busy schedule to answer a few questions for us. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe so you don't miss any new educational content, as well as leaving any comments below. The links to the Soul Food Web School as well as the links we mentioned are below. Thanks for joining.